we see each other, we have these conversations. Third parties usually organize around issues, ideas that really influences things. And I think it's just super important that we're here and we're doing this and we put pressure on the establishment and we keep people focused, right, on what's real and what's not real, and we can see through the corporates who claim to represent us, all right? So that's enough for me, but I just think it was great yesterday what we did. We all got together and we went and we presented 50,000 signatures to Bernie Sanders. He inspired me, he's inspired all of us, and now it's time for us to inspire him back. Yeah. So, here's a guy who spent his whole life proving that third parties and independent candidates can make a big difference. And now we just want to remind him of it. And so let me introduce our wonderful panel. We have a great panel. And let me start with the guy who put this all together, Nick Brana, ladies and gentlemen. He is personally say thank you, Nick, for doing this and for letting me be a part of it. It's been a real honor and a privilege to meet these people. It's really special. Everybody I meet here is just a great person, and their heads on straight, and you got them all together, so thanks for doing that. Now, everybody knows who Nick is. He's the former National Political Outreach Coordinator with Bernie 2016. He's the former electoral manager with Our Revolution. His vision for a government that serves the people and not the corporations led him to found the Draft Bernie for a People's Party movement. He's the guiding force behind the People's Convergence Conference and the Draft Bernie Town Hall. There he is. Next up, one of my personal heroes, Dr. Cornel West, a professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University. He has also taught at the Union Theological Seminary, Yale, Harvard, and the University of Paris. He graduated from magna cum laude from Harvard in 3 years, then obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton. He's written 20 books, including Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. And a big thrill of my life, the biggest honor so far, I met him tonight and he called me brother, because I always wanted to have that. That's really special. Our next guest, Kshama Sawant, is a socialist, Seattle City Councilwoman. She was successful in bringing about a minimum wage increase to $15 an hour. The Socialist Alternative Party and has been an activist for a movement to break the undemocratic power of big business and build a society that works for working people, not corporate profits, a democratic socialist party. Now, Nick, can I throw it to you and you just make an opening statement and let people know what's on your mind?
Absolutely. And since nobody got to do this, I want to say welcome to Jimmy Dore. This man keeps me sane, and I'm sure it's the same for many of you. Just knowing that he's out there and speaking the way that he does. So thank you, Jimmy. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of it. Thank you so much. There's nowhere else that you should be than on this panel. So
thank you, brother.
And I'd like to I'd like to speak, first of all, say thank you to everyone who is here and all of you who joined us to deliver the petition to Bernie Sanders, and all of you who worked so hard to collect those petitions, 50,000 strong. That's your work. You deserve a round of applause for that. Tremendous work that you put into that. And it really shows that this is the continuation of the Bernie Sanders campaign. And it's so great to be a part of that. I want to also thank everyone who's watching back. We've got thousands of people watching all across the country. More than 60 watch parties happening now in almost every state. So we have got people watching everywhere across the country participating in this conversation, and it goes to show just how far this conversation has come, and just how far this movement has come, and just how quickly change happens. How fast it can happen when we reach a point like this. So I want to start by saying that we live in a time of great, tremendous hardship for many people across the country. We have a neo-fascist as president. We have recently announced basically the cancellation of DACA, who doesn't believe in climate change, who is so regressive, who seems committed to making our country a second world country. But at the same time, it's a moment of such incredible opportunity for our movement, because the majority of the American people have come around to the conclusion that we need a new party. This is a representation of the majority of Americans right here, and that's really exciting. To quote Bernie Sanders, we have won the battle of ideas at this point. Support for Medicare for all, 2-to-1. Free public college, 2-to-1. Getting money out of politics, 9-to-1. Down the line, just like that. And so we are now at a point where we have won that battle of ideas, like Bernie Sanders said. But a dilemma has emerged as we look to translate those ideas into political power. Because what has happened now is that the more people realize that the more progressive people become, the more they realize that the Democratic Party does not represent them, that it doesn't represent their interests. And as a result of that, the more progressive the country becomes, the more people who leave the Democratic Party. And that's exactly what we're seeing now, in fact. And it's nothing new. Some people are aghast. Oh my gosh, you've got Bernie Sanders, the most popular politician in the country, trying to bring people into the Democratic Party. And at the same time, you've got Donald Trump, the most offensive character in the country, also trying to bring people into the Democratic Party. And yet, the Democratic Party is incredibly declining. It has declined in party affiliation since November, and it's a continuation of a long trend. And so the fact that those two incredible forces cannot bring people into a party shows actually the extent to which people are awake now, and to which they recognize it doesn't represent them. And that's the dilemma now, is that the country is with us on the issues and the ideas, but we lack an institution with the power, with the ability to actually translate that platform into political power. And that's what we're here to discuss tonight. It's really exciting to be discussing this question of where should the progressive movement go from here, with all of the new avenues that have opened up to us, with all of the new opportunities. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. West.
There you go. Testing. Can you hear me all right?
No.
Oh, testing. You know, little Barry White would do it. Let me first say I'm blessed to be here. I want to salute Brother Nick for his tremendous vision and his determination along with Sister Carol. Where's Sister Carol? Today, so give that a applause. I won't take too much time, but there's no doubt that I would not want to be any other place but here, because this particular gathering prefigures what is needed as the two-party system continues to degenerate. And as fellow citizens begin to see the unbelievable limitations and blindnesses of the corporate wing of the Democratic Party that is still in the driver's seat. I think that we have to be very honest and candid about where we are. We live not only in catastrophic times, not just horrible, Irma, Jose, and so forth, but it's catastrophe all the way down. It's ecological catastrophe. These things are not just happening as natural processes. It has something to do with corporate power that's been violating nature for so long, and nature now striking back. And this is just the beginning. The nuclear catastrophe, Russia, the United States, and the Democratic Party using Russia as some kind of excuse to not engage in serious self-criticism and interrogation. Political catastrophe, not just in Donald Trump. Let us never fetishize Donald Trump. Let's not give him magical power, some isolated individual. He is American as cherry pie. He comes out of American traditions of white supremacy and male supremacy and homophobia and transphobia, anti-Jewish sensibility, even with the Jewish daughter and son-in-law. Anti-Palestinians who would go ... Let's be very honest about that. But I want to say two things, because I look at it from the vantage point of the decline of the American empire. And we need to have spokespersons, candidates, who have enough courage to tell our fellow citizens the truth, that go beyond the very narrow constraints of corporate media on the one hand, and the corporate wing Democratic Party, and the right wing, and the neo-fascists, and the neo-Nazis, and the KKK, who also are fighting for public space as the empire melts down. As it melts down. It's not just the grotesque wealth inequality. It's not just the intensification of male supremacy and homophobia and transphobia. It's not just the expansion of the white supremacy, but it's the militarism and the imperialism too. You can't have a democratic experiment if 53 cents of your dollar are already headed to the military-industrial complex. You can't do it. You just can't do it. 4,855 military units, 857 of them overseas in 42 nations, special operations in 140 countries. There's only 192 countries in the world. That's military overreach tied to imperial ends and aims. As much as I love my dear brother Bernie Sanders, and I'm deeply disappointed he didn't have somebody there to receive those signatures. I don't mind disagreeing with my brother, but on a spiritual and a moral level, if you don't have somebody there to acknowledge the people who work so hard day in and day out just to receive the signatures, we have questions for you. We have questions for you. And it's not a matter of trashing Brother Bernie. It's not a matter of demeaning Brother Bernie. He must be accountable and answerable like anybody else, including ourselves. The last thing we want to see is our dear brother Bernie Sanders becoming too comfortable and adjusted to the corporate wing, the Schumers and the Pelosi's and the others. And the Hillary Clintons. Look like I just took a look at her book. Everybody's responsible but her. Exactly. So that the question becomes, we have to be honest enough to try to tell the truth.
Yeah.
There is a spiritual blackout afoot in the country. That's the relative eclipse of integrity, honesty, and decency. It cuts across race, gender, sexual orientation, region, and that has something to do with the decay inside of the empire. And the empire is devouring what's left of the democracy. And that's one of the reasons why the right wing, the neo-fascists, and the others are organizing so quickly. That's one of the reasons why a gangster like Donald Trump can fill a void. Because the establishment of the Republican Party shattered. The establishment of the Democratic Party was pushed against the wall, but that establishment unfairly, I think in many ways, almost robbed Bernie Sanders of his right due. And I think Bernie Sanders would have beat Donald Trump. That's what the polls say. Would have beat him. You cannot beat the enthusiasm of a gangster who will say anything is spectacle and no substance. But the corporate media who covered every word, every Twitter, every speech from the very beginning to the end to make money for revenues and ratings, and knowing it was bad for the country, allowed him unbelievable visibility. If they had given Bernie Sanders that kind of visibility, he'd probably be in the White House right now. So the question becomes, how do we attempt to be true to the best of what we understand ourselves to be, as people, as Americans, as human beings, and as internationalists? And we provide some alternative. Now, William James used to draw a distinction between live options and dead options. We've got to be a live option, a momentous one that has real concrete possibility. And my hunch is that even Brother Bernie may not last that long with the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, so he may come running many months from now. That's my hunch. But the point is, you can't proceed predicated on what he does. It's a matter of principle, and principle applies to persons across the board. And we also know that without some kind of fundamental coming together, I know people like to use the word coalition. I like to use the word solidarity. Yes. Solidarity. But there's no solidarity without integrity, honesty, and decency. It's not just a matter of ideology. It's a matter of the quality of the persons who are part of those who constitute a solidarity movement. So we've got to have the same righteous indignation when we see our brothers and sisters, disproportionately Latino and Mexican, being demonized, as we do when we see Palestinian babies killed in Gaza. We got the same righteous indignation when you see trans folk being attacked by the police, and gay brothers and lesbian sisters and bisexuals being demeaned. The same righteous indignation when you see black folk locked in to Jim Crow Jr. Not just the mass incarceration regimes, decrepit housing, massive unemployment, underemployment, indecent schools, on and on and on. When you see women having to deal with vicious domestic violence, is just a peak of an ugly patriarchal iceberg. That's the raw stuff that goes into both movements and creation of third-party formations. And if we don't have that kind of willingness and courage to enact some of that integrity, honesty, and decency, then the same old narrow Machiavellian politics of short-term gain tied to big money, tied to big militarism, tied to refusal to understand that poor people and working people must be at the center of any vision of a third party. That's the fundamental, and that's why I'm here. Thank you all for very
much. You talk very pretty. Very nice. Kshama? Go ahead.
Thank you. Is it on?
Sure.
So, sisters and brothers, it's really an honor to be with all of you, everybody who's watching on live stream, and also, as my esteemed fellow panelists have already said, we live truly in historic times, and what historic times they are. I mean, you have an unbelievable right-wing, misogynist, racist, xenophobic, bigot, billionaire in the White House. You have we've had almost an apocalyptic summer of climate change with symptoms of climate change with Harvey and Irma pummeling island after island, and we've also seen, as Brother Cornel West said, this grotesque inequality. Now 6 people own as much wealth as the bottom half of the entire world's population. That's 3.5 billion people. But at the same time, we're also seeing historic times for other reasons. We have seen incredible struggles against the oil industry by the No Dapple movement led by indigenous people and the environmental movement. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement, the first signs in decades of a real rebellion by young black people and other people of color, young people of color. And I think more than anything else, really the indications of the times we are living in are 2 things. One is that even though Trump was elected, look at the fact that he has no mandate. We saw the largest ever day of protest in US history with the Women's March, where more than 1 million people, I think several million people, marched on the streets. We have seen active and courageous opposition to the neo-Nazis. We saw how we tremendously outnumbered, the left tremendously outnumbered the neo-Nazis in Boston and shut their attempt to march on the streets. We shut it down. And more than anything else, we're seeing in America, which has been the belly of the capitalist beast, the most popular politician being this guy who calls himself openly as a democratic socialist. And he's the most popular politician not just among the ones who have been denigrated as the Bernie bros, all the white males here, It's not just among them, it's among black people, Latinos, women. These are all the oppressed sections of our society who recognize that the message of a political revolution against the billionaire class has been a long time coming, and we want to fight for a decent vision of society. And I think that's the most important message we should receive from the times we live in, which is that, yes, there is a current of racism and also something much scarier, that if the extreme right-wing ideology, which has been emboldened by the Trump election, and if given any more room, it will truly take on much more horrific forms. But the reality is that the majority of America is not on their side. The majority of America, especially young people, truly have a progressive vision for the kind of society they want to build. And so it's no surprise that the question that is the most immediate and uppermost on people's minds is, how do we defeat Trump and the right wing and the billionaire agenda? How do we do that? And I think that's the most important question for us too, as we talk about building a new party for working people, for the 99%. Defeating Trump obviously will take for us to stand in solidarity, as we already have, in defending the interests of everybody, every community that is in the crosshairs of Trump's attacks, as was already stated, trans people, LGBTQ community as a whole, immigrants who are now under attack, and everybody who really wants to politically mobilize against Donald Trump. But sisters and brothers, this is a bigger question. We are not going to be able to defeat Trump, much less make sure that the right has no increased room to build in. And as Brother Cornel said, there is a void that the right wing is filling. There's a void that Trump is filling. If we want to make sure that that void is no longer occupied and never again occupied by the right, then for us, It's a question, for us on the left, it's also a question of going on the offense. The reason Trump won is something that we have to take into account. Trump is a con man. He is a liar. But remember what he said on the campaign trail. He said he was for the forgotten men and women. He talked about jobs. He spoke to that every disenfranchised and disenchanted layer in our society, which is poor people, people who've been left out of any measure of prosperity, people who have lost their jobs because of NAFTA's destructive force, and so on and so on. And the reason he was able to fill that void was because Clinton simply did not convince voters that she was anything other than steeped in the Wall Street agenda. And as was already stated, we probably would have seen a different outcome if Bernie had run all the way to the general election, as Socialist Alternative and others were calling on him. So, sisters and brothers, to truly defeat Trump and the larger right wing, we cannot simply be on the defense, on the back foot. We have to go on the offense. But look at concrete examples. Well, a very concrete example of going on the offense is the question of single payer and Trump's attacks on the Affordable Care Act. What is the single most effective way we can, just defeat completely, forever and ever, the attempt to destroy affordable care as it is right now, the Obamacare? It's to fight for something better and win it, which is single-payer health care. But to do that, our movements not only have to be much more powerful than they are now, our movements will need political representation. We will need to challenge corporate power, not only in our workplaces and so on, but also in the political arena. And that leads us to the central question of our People's Convergence Conference, which is, what kind of party do working people, young people who are struggling in our society, what kind of party do we need? We need a party that will fight alongside social movements, not only for $15 an hour and single-payer healthcare, but go beyond that, fighting for full legalization and civil rights for all immigrants, ending police brutality, for indigenous rights. But for all of this, what is the basic requirement, the one lowest common denominator requirement we need in that party? That party cannot be wedded in any way to corporate power, to corporate money. That completely refuses to take any corporate cash, and Bernie Sanders showed on a very grand scale something that we had showed in Seattle already, which is that you can run successful campaigns and fight for working people, win elections on the basis of taking not a penny of corporate cash and really mobilizing, energizing people on the streets, sending them door knocking and so on. But the question we have to grapple as we talk about the question of a new party, sisters and brothers, is that the many people, the millions who have supported Bernie's campaign and are still energized about doing something, they would like to see a party like that. I don't think the debate is about the nature of that party. The debate is, how do we get there? What is the, what is the path towards that? And I think we have to take into account the fact that the majority of the people who are on our side as far as the vision of society are not ready yet in a very clear manner to build a new party. I think many, many millions of people still want to test out whether or not the Democratic Party can be that party. So how do we deal with this? I think it's very important for us to not, those of us who have already reached that conclusion that the Democratic Party cannot be that party, I've reached that conclusion. I'm very open about it. I don't lie to people and sow illusions in the Democratic Party in anyone's minds. But at the same time, I have to grapple with the fact that most people are probably still struggling with that concept, want to try it out in 2018, want to try it out in 2020. How do we deal with that? Number one, we cannot isolate ourselves from all those hundreds of thousands and millions. We have to have a very friendly and respectful conversation and debate with them where we don't lie to them, we are honest, We are not coy about our politics, but at the same time, we meet them where they are because they are going to be the major forces of this new party that we want to build. And so we have to be very careful that we urge them to come with us and so on. I just wanted to, just a couple of more points before I end. Yesterday at the rally, one of the reporters who was there asked me, don't you think this is the exact wrong time for you guys to be talking about this? Because don't we need a united effort? I mean, it was let's face it, this is a serious question on people's minds. Don't you think we need to be united against Trump? Isn't the left being divisive by doing these events like this? I think it's a serious question, and it deserves a serious answer. And what is the response to that? The response to that is absolutely, we want maximum unity against Trump, but it's a question of what kind of unity. I think Brother Cornel really hit the nail on the head when he said that when we talk about coalitions, that solidarity has to be based on integrity. It has to be a principled unity, and such a unity, and we have to be open with people who want to test out the Democratic Party, that unity has to mean unity among ordinary working people who want to fight corporations and Wall Street. Unity does not mean going along with what Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi want. And in the process of building that unity, we have to bring up concrete strategies and tactics that can unite people. So I'll end with this concrete example. I guarantee you, sisters and brothers, when we go out there and start talking about the need for a new party, we will run into a lot of people who will agree with us about a lot of the things that we're talking about, how society is broken. They don't need explanations of that what we have on offer is not working. But they will probably, many of them, disagree with exactly what to do next. So let's make it concrete. For those people who are not ready to immediately break from the Democrats and launch a new party, let's ask them concretely. Look at the movement for single-payer health care in California. Was that not a brilliant, inspiring example of unity or not? A lot of activists, the nurses union, Bernie-crats, a lot of independents, probably a lot of people who voted for Hillary holding their nose, they were all supportive of single-payer health care. What was the single obstacle to that? It was the Democratic establishment, right? So let's make it concrete. You're not ready to start a new party? Let's talk about actual things. And Marty Harrison, who's a nurse in Philadelphia and a union organizer, spoke about this in the earlier discussion on healthcare. She said, why don't we, our movement, the nurses unions, all the other labor movement members who want to be part of it, Bernie-crats, our revolution, everybody who wants to fight for single-payer healthcare, I don't care whom you voted for last year. If you want to fight for single-payer healthcare, why don't we issue a serious challenge to Rendon? Let's tell him, you were the obstacle behind this, to this. So we are going to build a powerful movement to bring you down. We are going to run a serious challenger, serious independent campaign against Rendon when he's next up for election. I'm not sure when that is, but let's make sure that it is a concrete challenge against the Democrats. And we don't want to just run pressure campaigns. We are not a pressure group. We are fighting for a different vision of society. So if we run a campaign, we should run to win. And I will guarantee you that kind of serious challenge will put the fear of God in the establishment Democrats. And that will be a starting point in many ways. And the most important way it will be a starting point is because it will bring a real inspiring sort of electrification for all the people who are grappling with differences on concrete questions of which party to support and all of that. But they will agree on this. They will agree that in order to fight single-payer healthcare, we need to fight corporate Democrats. And this will be a starting point. And if we were to win, I'll end on this. If we were to win single-payer healthcare in any state, especially some major state like California, it will be an earth-shattering impact of that. So let's fight for concrete victories like that.
Yay.
So that was wonderful. you also speak very pretty. You know, I just, before we're going to take questions from the audience, and you know, when you were on my show last year, and you made a statement, and at the time I thought it was crazy. You told me that the Democrats would rather lose to a Republican than win with a progressive, and I was like, boy, that lady, I really like her, but she's a little. I was like, I get it, you got to be out there, but she was 100. I was wrong. I had my head in the sand. I didn't believe that was true. And, you know, she's 100% right about that. And so I can't give my vote to a corporatist warmonger anymore in an attempt to bring unity to what? I don't want it. So anytime, I'm all for unity, and anytime Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, anytime they want to unify behind progressives, the most popular politician in the country, we're ready for her. Anytime. So it's weird when they tell progressives to unify, they mean drop your values and get behind corporatists, right? And work against yourself. It's funny, the Republicans have always had a way to find working people to get them to vote against their own interests. And now the Democrats have found a way to get Democrats to vote against their own interests. And what they do is they wag your finger at progressives and say Donald Trump. And that's how they get you to vote against your own interests. Okay. Do we take questions now and then let that?
Gotcha, Jimmy. Bring up some points.
Okay. Well, I do want to bring up that point that why do you? Hillary Clinton was the only politician I think that I've ever seen who wasn't expected to campaign for votes. Really, she was like, we were just supposed to vote for her, and if I didn't vote for her, I'm a bad person. Right. So let's just talk about how did the Democratic Party get to that point, and why is there no one in the establishment media that brings this up?
Well, I think the establishment media is so bought. I mean, come on, they work. It's the same organizations that are paying for the campaigns, the same organizations that are paying for the candidates. So you can't expect it. That's what Noam Chomsky means when he says it's a one-party state. He says it's basically two different versions, two different branches of the same corporation. Taking money, is it any surprise that the two parties have variations of the same policies when they take money from the exact same corporations, the exact same billionaires? Is it any wonder? Is it any wonder that the corporate media does the exact same thing when they also take money from the exact same interest? I think it's important too, Jimmy, to what Kshama was saying earlier. I think that Bernie's campaign dealt the decisive blow to incrementalism. Bernie's campaign showed us what the recipe for success is. Now, it's you go out and you speak about undiluted progressive values. That's it. You speak undiluted policies. You are clear. You don't retreat. You go out and you simply speak to what people want to hear. The majority of the American people now are on board with these issues. And when you represent them in an unabashed way, when you're bold about it, that's what inspired that revolution that Bernie started. It's amazing. Bernie started with no money. He started with no media. He started with no name recognition. You know, there was an anointed candidate against him, Hillary Clinton. He had every single thing against him. And yet, what did he have? So what was the one thing that he did have that allowed him to... That's right. That allowed him to overcome all of that. He had that revolutionary progressive message, and he had integrity. And it turned out that was more powerful, and that is more powerful today in our politics than those other things. And what the pundits want us to believe is what determines success. That's the most powerful thing today.
I agree. Fantastic. Dr. West. I saw you with Tavis Smiley on the Carol Costello show on CNN, and I think that's when you started wearing that around your neck because I thought your head was going to fly off. And you were trying to urge the president Barack Obama to address poverty in America and income inequality. And, you know, Paul Krugman used to write columns about that, saying that if the Democrats don't address income inequality, we're headed for fascism. And here we are. Now, my first question is, when you were criticizing Barack Obama like that, was it because you were racist?
Well, I did, brother. He's an artist and a comic at the same time. Appreciate that question, brother. No, I think that I always look at the world through moral and spiritual lens. And I look at the soul craft that's dominant at any particular moment. In the last 35 years, it's been the neoliberal soul craft. The way to be in the world is to be the smartest and the richest and to drop the most bombs to have power. You see? So that our young people are socialized to be the smartest in the room, not the wisest. The smartest in the room, not the most courageous. The smartest in the room, not the most compassionate. I'm not a neoliberal at the spiritual moral level at all. I come out of a different legacy. I come out of a very different legacy. Let the phones be smart. I got to be something else. I got to be courageous, compassionate, sacrificial, willing to tell the truth and bear witness. You see. And so the neoliberal ideology that took off under Jimmy Carter, but became very much hegemonic under Bill Clinton in the first term. Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, these are not isolated individuals. They're part of a neoliberal way of looking at the world that needs to be radically called into question in terms of the kind of human being you want to be before the worms get you. It's a moral, spiritual perspective. And that's why Martin King and Dorothy Day and Edward Said and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Tom Hayden, their voice must come back with power. With power. And so the reason why we were critical of Barack Obama was, here he got Martin Luther King's face projected every day in the Oval Office and wouldn't mention the word poverty and was dropping thousands of bombs on Muslim countries and engaging in drone strikes of hundreds, killing innocent people as if somebody in Yemen and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Somalia don't have the same value as white folk in Newtown or black folk in the south side of Chicago or indigenous peoples in Wisconsin or Jewish babies in Tel Aviv or Palestinian babies in Gaza. You see, that wasn't what the critique was, you see. And so when I was engaged in a critique of Barack Obama, it was a matter of saying, look, you are a neoliberal. You are the black face of the American empire. You are brilliant. You have poise, but you still are complicitous with the mendacity and the criminality of the American empire. That's what got me in trouble. And I welcome that kind of trouble because I'm going to be speaking that until I die. I'm going to be faithful unto death.
Kshama, if I could ask you, now you're a great organizer, you've got great accomplishments in fighting the establishment and fighting the system. One of the last social mechanisms to push back against the bastards is the unions. And so I can understand why what can we do? Help us understand what we can do to help a union organizing, like to help. I want to understand, why can't we organize, or how can we organize Walmarts? I think that would change a lot of things in the United States. If we could, Walmart has unions in other countries. They just don't have them here. Same thing with Nissan. They have unions in every other plant in the world that they have. They have 47. They're all unionized except for the 3 they have in the United States. So can you talk about that? How can we unionize people and make that movement stronger so we can push back?
I think the question of the labor movement is really important. I'm so glad, Jimmy, that you brought that up. I mean, it's in many ways, actually, it's absolutely central to the question of organizing to win even basic reforms in our society right now, let alone making any kind of fundamental shift. And it's absolutely true that in the United States, the labor movement has experienced not just a decline, but an absolute decimation in the last 4 decades. And it's true that the decline has been different and much less pronounced in, say, Western Europe, but it's happening there too. And actually, across the globe, what you can see, and this is why I think it's important to talk about the capitalism itself and not just reforms under capitalism, because what has happened in the last several decades is a process, is a phenomenon of the capitalist system demonstrating its just incredible ability to adapt itself to changing conditions and then take it to its own advantage. It's an incredibly malleable system. And why do I say that? It means that, obviously, if you look at the trajectory of social movements from, say, the late 19th century and so on, you see inspiring and really powerful labor movements in the United States. I know that history is lost to many of us who are alive today because we've not experienced that feeling. Most of us are not in a labor union. But the reality is that the United States has some really inspiring history of labor organizing. And in fact, it was the one force that actually brought people from various nationalities. There were immigrants from different countries in the United States working in many of the manufacturing jobs, and they were part of forming the early labor movements. And I'm sure you guys have seen those bumper stickers that say, if you like the weekend, thank the labor movement, because the labor movement fought for the 8-hour and 40-hour work week, 8-hour work day and the 40-hour work week. So in reality, the labor movement had been in the past able to, on both sides of the Atlantic, because of really strong, radical organizing, determined organizing, being able to wrest some concessions and really grab some concessions from the capitalist class. And I'm using that language deliberately because the capitalist class, this is an exploitative system in its very DNA. The capitalist class, the ruling elite, the bosses, they don't give us these things because they think it's nice for them. I know there's this whole mythology of how Henry Ford was a nice guy and is so smart, and that's why we won those gains in the Midwest. No, that is not the reason we won. We won those gains in the auto industry because the workers organized and built powerful, radical labor movements. And many times, in fact, maybe virtually every time, they were led not just by radical labor activists. Many of them were socialists because they understood what it took to fight against the bosses. And so communists too. And communists. Oh, yeah. And so what is the capitalist, what is the system capable of doing? It is capable of then, over decades pushing back against those gains. And so the Reagan era, the Reagan-Margaret Thatcher era was the vicious era of counter-revolution. It was like reactionary forces against labor unions. And then since then, there's been a massive decline. And so how do we revive that back into a fighting labor movement? It will take massive social movements. I have to say, unfortunately, I'm not sure to what extent the origination of such radical movements will come from within today's labor movement itself. I speak frankly as a rank-and-file member of the labor movement. I'm a member of the teachers' union. And I say this honestly. I think that there's been a decades-long practice of a bureaucratic approach, of a deal-making approach with the bosses for so long that I don't think, as a social movement, as a whole, we should wait on the current organized labor movement to deliver these victories. I think many are doing that, and their unions and members are sitting right here, especially the nurses' unions, who have shown the way forward. The nurses' union, the CWA, supported Bernie Sanders' campaign. They themselves have led inspiring strike actions, but they are exceptions to the norm. So ultimately, to revive the labor movement and to, and much less to make it a fighting democratic labor movement, we will need a fight back from every sector. And in many ways, those struggles will be and will have to be led by non-unionized workers. So we can't, we're going to have to push that forward in many different ways. But when we do, like for example, when we are fighting for black rights against police brutality, when we are fighting against sexual violence on university campuses, when we are fighting, to divest from Wells Fargo, I don't care what the starting point of our struggles are. Ultimately, in all of those movements, we have to raise the question of building a radical labor movement. And those social fight back, I think that they can be a starting point for then talking about how we can build our own unions. And those unions, as we have learned bitter lessons throughout history, have to be democratically organized, because otherwise they will end up capitulating to capitalist forces.
Okay. And I think what Kshama was touching on there, which is so important, is our theory of change as a society. How does change happen? Does it happen when we go into the party and we ask nicely of elites? Does it happen? That change has never happened. From medieval times to the present, change has never happened by requesting that the owners relinquish their power. Rather, it has always happened because working people, because people themselves have threatened the established powers rather with replacing them and with an alternative. And that is why now the best way, as many have said, is to look back into our own history as we confront this question of how do we advance, how do we achieve the policies that the majority agree with. It's to look into our own history and see which offers actually a model for this. How was it that the 40-hour work week was achieved? How was it that Social Security was achieved? How was it that women's suffrage? How was it that abolition was achieved? In all of these instances, there was significant third-party threats, and they threatened to either replace the Democratic Party, replace the party in power. In the case of the Lincoln's Republicans, they actually did replace the Whigs on the question of abolition. And so when we now reflect on what is it that our movement is lacking, why is it that even the Democratic Party feels so free to dismiss us? And I speak specifically to those who think now that we should reform the Democratic Party. It is because we lack the leverage that movements of the past, progressive movements, have had. We don't have that component. We don't have a strong third party, an external force that is actually threatening a major party. And that's why the case that we've made with Draft Bernie for the past, since February, since we launched, is that the best way to reform the Democratic Party, if you still believe that's possible, is to start a new party as well. Yeah. Yes. That's the only way you're going to bring them to the table. We've seen how they respond when you don't have that kind of leverage. It's what they do to Bernie. It's what they've practically said in open court that they'll do to Bernie again if he runs in 2020 as a Democrat. They admitted we'll rig the primary against you again. So that's what we face, and I think that is a central question of how does change happen. That's what we have to confront.
Wow, that's fantastic, Nick. Thank you. I wanted to, real quick, I don't know if this is off point, but it's on my mind, so I want to bring it up. I heard you talk on Democracy Now!, Dr. West, about what happened in Charlottesville. And so there's been a lot of discussion about Antifa, and I just wonder what your thoughts are about them. And, I saw Chris Hedges write a piece that kind of disturbed me a little bit, and I was just wondering what everyone's thoughts are on that.
Well, yeah, I'm anxious to hear from the audience myself, but I'm not one to use a lot of new terminology. You're either anti-fascist, neo-fascist, all this alt-right, alt-left, alt-so-and-so. No, you're left, you're a communist, you're an anarchist. They saved our lives in Charlottesville. And it wasn't just Antifa as an abstraction. These are human beings who are part of an anarchic movement. There was a slice of communists there. They have always been my comrades. Of course, I have deep disagreements with them in terms of their understandings of the past and relation of Stalinism and Leninism and so forth and so on. But they're my comrades nevertheless in terms of struggles against predatory capitalism, patriarchy, imperialism. And if they don't want to be critical about Stalin, I will be. But in the streets, they're there. In the foxholes, they're there. That makes a difference to me. And it's a matter of being honest about who comrades are concretely, even given ideological disagreements. I would rather be in a foxhole with an anarchist than be in a foxhole with some of my professors. That's a fact. They will leave you in a minute. That doesn't mean you don't bring critique to bear. Christopher Hedges is my very dear brother. I can agree and disagree with him in terms of how he formulates it and so on. You see. But I think when you have an anti-fascist coalition, you've got a number of different voices and perspectives and orientations there, and you're still honest about concretely in that foxhole who is your comrade and who is not.
Okay. So, you know, I made the statement that I remember the last time the Antifa fought the Nazis, it was in Normandy. And is that a good joke? Is that not a good joke? You know, I mean, like, is that the same thing? Is it different things? People are, like, how do you fight back against Nazis? I think we're supposed to be tolerant of everything except intolerance, right? Because I keep hearing these statements from people that said, you know, we ignored the Nazis and Hitler because he thought we were a fringe group and, you know, he never did get a majority. But what, so how do you fight back against fascists?
Somebody in the audience ought to answer that.
Okay. All right, let's go. You know what? All right, let's go to a... People want to ask questions from the audience. I have a few people. Daniel DeCeter. Is Daniel DeCeter here? Daniel, go. He's from Durham, North Carolina. Daniel, where are you? Go ahead, ask your question. I'm not smart enough to answer your question, but I will throw it to the smart people. Okay, the question is how long can we wait for the two parties to address climate change and the oil companies, fossil fuels? I think we're past the point. Obviously, look what's been happening. We're past the point of waiting. You know, we're in a climate crisis right now. It's not climate change, it's climate crisis. It's happened. I'm not, again, these people are way smarter than me. They could probably tell you what we should do.
We have two parties who, just like the oil companies, have known about it, like you said, from the beginning, you know, and yet even the Democratic Party, it was Barack Obama who opened up fracking. He sold us on fracking as a solution to climate change, along with Hillary.
That's clean
right.
bridge to the future, baby.
That's right. Now we've learned that fracking is in many ways, of course, worse, and on top of all the horrendous consequences that comes with. Earthquakes and polluted water. Water so polluted that it lights on fire. So, and on top of that, it was Barack Obama, again, who actually expanded offshore drilling in the United States. Barack Obama, who proudly said, we're going to achieve energy independence by exploiting as much fossil fuel as we can here in the United States, as if that's something to be proud of. And it was, of course, Barack Obama who didn't stand for indigenous people at Standing Rock, which is astonishing because Barack Obama knew that Trump was going to reverse the decision in the end anyways, and yet he still couldn't take a stand. And so it shows really how entrenched the two parties are. He could have simply taken the political credit for doing that, and yet he couldn't even do that for people. It really took a young woman's arm getting blown off, really, before he decided, oh, now it's enough of a political liability for me, and I'll just let Trump reverse it in a couple months. So this gets to why I would say that, I mean, we need to start coming together. That is why I'm so glad to see that everybody's here to start coming together to form a new party, to do that.
Yes. Kshama, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, as Jimmy said, you know, we're, in many ways, some things that have already happened are not reversible. But we are, if we take certain action, we can, you know, stop what's going to happen in the future if we don't do something about it. But I think ultimately, at this point anyway, even, you know, if this was 30 years ago, maybe we could have actually had a debate about whether climate change is happening or not. But at this point, most ordinary people across the world understand the dangers. Many of them are living those dangers. You know, the most vulnerable, the people who are already most vulnerable under capitalism are also the most immediately attacked by climate change. You know, look at the floods in Bangladesh. 2/3 of Bangladesh is underwater, submerged underwater right now. And it's one of the poorest countries, most exploited countries in the neoliberal context. And so I think the question about climate change is not a question about, you know, whether you're the most qualified in climate science. You don't need to be a climate scientist to understand what's happening. What we need is a political strategy. And I think something that Nick said, you know, sort of goes to the heart of the matter. You know, if you look at the sources of the climate change, so the biggest sources of carbon emission since the Second World War, which is the period when the most of the human emissions have happened in the entirety of the human existence. If you look at who are the polluters, who are the biggest polluters, the answer, you know, the solution to that, to carbon emissions, stopping carbon emissions and methane and so on, cannot be lifestyle changes by ordinary people. You make all the lifestyle changes you want, and you should, if you can, to the extent that you can. But it's not, you know, the solution is not everybody trying to buy an overpriced Tesla to make sure that you're not polluting the environment, or sweltering in the heat without air conditioning. The point is that the vast majority of carbon emissions are corporate. They originate in corporations, in the way that our systems run, in the fact that even though most people in Seattle, for example, where I'm from, agree about the need for a world-class, high-frequency mass transit corridor, we don't get it. Why? For two reasons. One is that all the resources are in the hands of a few oil bosses. The 90% of pollution is from the major oil corporations, and you and I have no say in what happens there. So that's one question. And then politics. Who are the politicians aligned with? If you have political parties that are deeply entrenched with these same oil bosses and the financial oligarchy that underwrites these fossil fuel projects, then there is no hope of changing from it. And the barrier is not that they have low IQ and they don't get climate change. They do. But it is a systemic question. When you are a capitalist, you know, a member of the capitalist class, it is not in your interest. You have no incentive to move towards renewable energy, and no oil boss is going to do that out of the goodness of their heart. So ultimately, if we are serious about stopping climate change right now and actually saving the human race and for future generations, then it really does pose a political question of who owns resources. And I have to say, it really poses seriously the question of democratic public ownership of the oil corporations. As long as it is in their hands, we're not going to be able to solve this problem. And how do we get there? I mean, if we agree, let's say we agree, and if not, of course, we can debate. But if we agree that politically dealing with climate change will require taking the top oil corporations into democratic public ownership, and also the financial corporations into public ownership, how do we get there? We will need, first of all, we will need to pose our movements, our environmental, indigenous, social movements, everybody who's fighting against climate change. We will have to pose the demands, the political demands of this movement in solidarity with the workers who work in the oil industry, which means that we have to pose demands not just of environmental changes, but of a just transition for jobs from the oil sector to renewable energy. So we have to fight for a living wage unionized job for everybody who is currently employed in the oil sector so that we can get their solidarity, because right now it's concretely posed to them. They may agree in the abstract about the dangers of climate change, but today their paycheck depends on going to work at the oil rig. So it's incumbent on our movement to pose demands in solidarity with them. And ultimately, we are not going to be able to do that unless we also take on the gnarly question of the labor movement itself. Unless the labor movement and the labor leadership is forced by our democratic force, by the rank and file, to break from the Democratic Party, to break that unholy alliance once and for all, we're not going to be able to make that shift.
Wow. Okay, let's go ahead and take another question from Robert Blanford from Washington, D.C. Robert, are you here? Stand up, ask your question.
Robert, come up.
A little music in the middle, thank you. A little music while we wait for him to get the microphone. A little music, okay. Thank you for the music.
Yes, I'd like to speak about, briefly about personal experience before I get into a question. It's about rent control in Washington, D.C. Some years back, I was renting and I had a problem, so I wrote the landlord and asked him to fix the housing code violations. And he said, well, send the rent, I'll get to it. I didn't send the rent because I knew the law, so he took me to landlord and tenant court. And I argued my case, and the judge put the money in an escrow account. He couldn't get the money. And so some other tenants heard about it. And so they met with me and wanted to develop that strategy. Over a 3-year period, I organized 23 tenant organizations in Washington. And what we did was many of those tenant organizations purchased their buildings. And they're stable homeowners now. They developed cooperatives because we had situations where back then, the rent was low. It's high now. The housing code violations were more expensive than the rent that the landlord was getting. So the district had a law, the first right of refusal. So that means that he had to offer first the unit to the tenants. So that was the way that they were able to purchase their units. And we worked with the district government. We organized to get rent control. So we got a strong rent control bill. But what happened was that I knew this guy who wanted to be a politician, and he didn't even know how to button his shirt up right. And he couldn't even have a chicken dinner, organize a chicken dinner to raise some money. But anyway, I saw him later. He had on expensive suits, and he had commercials all over the TV. The board of realtors had backed him, and he pushed vacancy decontrol, and that's what gutted and killed rent control in Washington, D.C. Vacancy decontrol, which means that whenever you move out of a unit, it's no longer under rent control. For instance, if you look at a person my age, 70, who's been in his apartment for 30 years in D.C., he might be paying $700. But if you walk off the street to buy a unit, it's going to be $1,200 at least, if you try to buy now. So vacancy decontrol over a period of time, because some people bought homes, other people lost their homes, lost their apartments, couldn't pay for them. So there's a turnover in units. So effectively, it destroyed rent control, that one thing, vacancy decontrol, because he slipped in the back door. So my question is, if we, in organizing a People's Party, how do we deal with government officials, and how do we deal to ensure that those officials will be accountable to the people that they are supposed to serve?
Yeah. First, I just want to salute the work that you've done, though, the witness that you've borne, though. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, that's what this gathering is all about. It's about fight back, because we live in a predatory capitalist civilization. The bottom line is greed, greed, greed. You could be callous and indifferent to working people and vulnerable people. Happens in D.C. It happens in Palo Alto, East Palo Alto. Happens in Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant. It happens in Chicago. It's called a power grab. It's a land grab. You're trying to gain access to a space where you're pushing other folk out and you don't care about what happens to them. It's just a matter of either making profits or bringing in folk who can pay those big monies so that the profit is circulated and it stays at the top. And the result is what? A massive transfer of wealth from poor and working people to the well-to-do. Redistribution that takes place, but it's a redistribution that goes upward rather than downward. And your fight back was one trying to make sure that working people and poor people treated with dignity. And so accountability is fundamental. In a predatory capitalist civilization, everything is for sale, but everybody is for sale. That brother who you saw walking around with his sharp suit on, he opted for spectacle and money rather than substance and being a decent human being. And you got to tell him that. You got to tell him that. We've got to be honest about folk when they sell out. You be candid about folk. You ought to be answerable. You ought to be responsible. You ought to be shame on yourself that you would allow yourself to get bought like that and your grandfathers, your cousins and others catching hell over here. Who do you think you are? And that same person, they probably want to put Martin Luther King Jr. in their office too. No, you don't deserve that picture. Take him out. Put in another game.
I also wanted to echo Brother Cornel's congratulations, Robert, for your work on rent control. And in fact, the loophole that he mentioned, vacancy decontrol, just before talking about how do you keep politicians accountable, I think that has been the story virtually in every fight for rent control. Throughout the last 5 decades, whenever there's been a fight, and there's been many cities, including Seattle, where there was serious movements across the decades for rent control because for the simple reason that housing is so expensive and cities are basically not open for working people. Every time there's a movement for rent control, the movement it's one of two outcomes. Either the movement is completely defeated by the real estate lobby, by big developers, by the landlords, and the politicians who are in their pockets. Or if the movement does succeed, where it has succeeded in D.C., in New York City, also it succeeded in the past in Berkeley and so on, in many cases, the movements were strong, but then this is why it's a political question. It's a question of balance of forces. If you are strong, you're strong enough that they can't just simply make you go away, then they have to relent. They meaning the politicians, the real estate lobby, they have to relent and allow rent control to happen, but they write the demise of the rent control in the law itself. So vacancy decontrol is like basically saying rent control will not be rent control after a little while. And so that the message to us from the past, both the victories and the defeats, is that our movements have to be powerful enough that they have to, the balance of forces has to be such that you are able to completely overcome the tooth and nail opposition of the real estate lobby and the politicians. And how do you achieve that? And a broader question connected to that is, how do you keep politicians accountable? I just wanted to address that by giving the example of Socialist Alternative. I'm not arguing for Socialist Alternative to be this new party, but I'm saying that the new party that we struggle for has to have a certain basic framework in place if it is to work for working people. I'm telling you, a lot of Americans talk to me about a third party. I'm like, I come from India where there's a multitude of parties and not one frickin' party represents the needs of working people. So it's a question of what kind of party. And it's not a magical question. These are concrete political questions. How do you make sure that the political organization that is being put in place to represent the interests of the poor, the oppressed, working class people, black and brown people, and women, how do you actually make it work? So the socialist in Socialist Alternative, the way we do it is completely unlike the Democratic Party. Somebody mentioned today the Democratic Party doesn't have members; it just has voters. That's not a model for an actual accountability in any way, shape, or form, because the Democratic Party establishment just simply comes for votes. But when was the last time you or I were invited to a meeting, your local Democratic Party, where you had the chance to weigh in on and vote on a program, the political program that the candidate next year is going to be running on. There is a total absence of any democracy in the parties that we see today, the ruling class parties. In socialist alternative, when everybody sees me on the forefront, but the reality is that the reason I've been able to succeed is because I have an organization with me and I'm not alone. I don't stand alone, so it helps me to not be isolated. But at the same time, that organization holds our candidates accountable. And so when we discuss running an election campaign, which is not always, but when we talk about running an election campaigns, who will be the candidate? What will be the political program of that campaign? How we will conduct the campaign, how many door-knocking sessions, how many tabling stalls, all of this is subject to actual democratic discussion and debate and vote. And then furthermore, the politics of the organization, the political organization that supports these candidates is important. When we run campaigns, our candidates pledge that we will only take the average worker's salary if we are elected. The city council pays me. The official salary that city council members in Seattle are paid is roughly $120,000. I take home the average worker's salary in Seattle, and after taxes, the rest of the money, which is quite a bit, is put into a solidarity fund for social movements. This is very important because it is in no way a career avenue for any professional politician. It is a question of somebody who is truly dedicated to social movements coming and giving up. It's a sacrifice to give up your time and money in order to do that. We also run our campaigns by pledging that we will not take a penny of corporate cash. That is extremely important. So we have to have, if we are talking seriously about a new political party, which we will need in order for accountability, that party has to have this basic framework in place. So we may have a lot of disagreements, and we should expect that this project of a new party for working people, and 99%, will have a lot of different kinds of people. We will have a lot of disagreement. We are not going to agree on, for example, the exact nature of socialist revolution. We are not going to. But that should not be the goal. It would be foolhardy of us to debate on that at this stage. What is most important is that we actually agree on the basics of what kind of party we want, which is not in any way related to corporate money, which a party in which people, ordinary people, working people, get to come to meetings that are held after work hours, which are accessible in neighborhoods where women, single moms, don't have to commute long distances to make their political representation felt in the party, where you get to vote on the program, get to vote on the candidate, and if the candidate is elected, you get to participate and have a real voice in what that elected official says. So if the elected official betrays your interests, your party gets to bring them down.
Okay, yes, fantastic. Yes. Before we get to the next question, there doesn't seem to be any politicians who are anti-war anymore. In 2008, Barney Frank, of all people, proposed cutting the Pentagon budget 25%. And when they asked him what to cut, he said, I don't know, but that sounds like a good number to start. What the hell happened to that? And that's not, he's not a real progressive, and he was saying that in 2008. How come no one says that, and how can we get back to waking up the anti-war movement or the peace movement, not only among the citizenry? It's like we just accept it, that this is, Joe Scarborough tweeted out the other day that, his grandparents' generation fought the Nazis and all that stuff, and today's millennials are sitting on their couch playing video games. A guy like that doesn't even realize that today's millennials are fighting in the longest war in the history of our country.
But we got Medea Benjamin in the house. She's been fundamental part of the anti-war movement for a long time. Very important. And that's just Cold Pink. Cold Pink is just one of those magnificent groups that trying to keep alive. It's not just anti-war, it's anti-imperialism. It's anti-militarism, you see. And it would be a wonderful thing to see that among the younger generation. You see, when they have that kind of anti-militarism, anti-war, anti-imperialist energy galvanizing that brings pressure to bear on these politicians.
Yeah, it's just like we've become this. Our culture is a military. It's the culture. I went to the Rose Bowl last year, and they have the B-1 bomber fly over, and everybody's like, and I'm like, we're looking at it like it's some kind of carnival ride, and most of the world, when they see that, are going to be dead soon. They see it in a totally different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, all right. Well, hats off to Medea, and there's nothing that warms my heart more is when I see a warmonger like John Kerry giving Senate testimony, and I see a bunch of blood-soaked hands standing behind him, and it's fantastic. So thanks for doing that. Leslie Cox. Is Leslie Cox here from Scottsdale, Arizona? Leslie? Oh, hi, Leslie. Can you have a question? Let's give you want to give a microphone, Nick?
Hi, I am from Kentucky originally, and I grew up in a part of the country that heated their homes with coal. So since I was 3 months old, I've had lung disease. I started out with asthma. Now I have COPD, chronic bronchitis. And because I didn't have good health care, because it was too expensive and prohibitive, my heart trying to pump into my lungs caused my heart to enlarge, so now I have congestive heart failure in addition to the lung problems. So recently, after Trump was elected, actually, I'm not drawing any analogy, but that's when it happened. Medicare Part D, which at the time the Republicans and the Democrats joined together to prohibit the country from negotiating drug prices. They do it for the VA. There's no reason it couldn't have been part of this program. But the Medigap that I have that takes care of that has raised the price on their drugs. They have decided that they're not going to cover a couple of the things that I have to live. And so my husband has had to work past retirement to buy these because we have to pay cash for them. We have to pay our insurance premiums, and then we have to pay cash for the medicine. So I've worked 60 years in the Democratic Party since I was 10 years old up until last summer. And I have seen them get more corporate and less interested in my problems. And I think about the people who don't have a husband. I know a lot of women who have serious lung problems, have other problems, and they don't have husbands to take up the slack. And I think that we have to figure out a way, and what my question is how can we convince the country that there is the third party is the only way we're ever going to have health care for everybody?
I think the best way to convince people the necessity of a third party to push for single payer is the example we have that was set in California. California is a supermajority Democratic Party, and we don't have single payer. And it was because when we all came out in January to vote for our Democratic delegates to the California Party's convention, Bernie-crats overwhelmingly came out, and we thought we had taken over the party. We all high-fived each other, and we went home happy. It turns out that the Democratic Party has rigged it again in California. So cut to the chase, they screwed over Kimberly Ellis, and they installed literally a pharmaceutical lobbyist as the chairman of the Democratic Party in California. And so tell them that story, and I think that will convince them. Bernie used to point to California And when we voted in January, he held it up as an example. This is how you do it. This is how you take over the party. Well, they've rigged the system, and they ain't letting go of the party. In fact, they told the progressives and the nurses and everybody who wanted single payer to shut the fuck up or get out. That's what they said. That was the chairman of the party at the time who said that, who was handing it off to a pharmaceutical lobbyist to be chairman of the party. So why don't you show them that video, send them that video, and tell them this story, and that's how they'll get the idea that no matter how many Democrats are in party, we need a third party.
And it gets even worse because Medicare for all, single payer, has been in the party's platform in California for decades now. And yet somehow, and the Democrats have controlled that state for almost that entire time, and yet somehow they managed to never actually pass it. In fact, even the legislator who proposed the single-payer bill, the Democrat, actually was not making a good faith effort to actually advance it. So he proposed it as a political stunt. Even the man who put it up, the Democratic legislator, Jerry Brown, is, of course, opposed to it, California's Democratic governor. It was Anthony Rendon who opposed it, the Democratic Assembly Speaker. So as those inside the establishment, and the Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the Donna Brazils and the Tom Perez's of the country tell us, the solution is just to elect Democrats. It's just to elect Democrats. That's it. No, that's what happens. Look at the states that are run by Democrats. That's what we get when we elect Democrats. Look at what happened when Barack Obama was elected. Look at how quickly those promises vanished. Promises to go after the bankers. Promises to address climate change. Promises to actually on single payer himself, which he had a debate with Hillary over. That's what happens when the Democratic Party gets to power. That's not enough. And in fact, it is the fact that the Democratic Party is of that nature which produces Trump in the first place, which is another thing that has to be said. It has to be said, I think, over and over, that Trump is a symptom. Trump is just a symptom of a much larger disease, and that is the absence of a working class party in this country.
Here, here. Kshama. Okay, we're going to take another question, but Kshama had wanted to add to that.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I think Jimmy and Nick are absolutely right that the question of single-payer healthcare is very much is an example of an aspect of social change that is deeply interconnected with the political question of a real political representation for working people. I think there's a very important example from how Canada won its healthcare system. The way Canada got single payer was not by one of the ruling parties doing it at the center, at the federal level. In reality, it was labor movements and social movements, once again, often led by socialists and other radicals, that recognize that it is not just important for them to unionize and organize workplace actions, but that they had to have a political arm as well for their movement. And so they did actually build a third party. And this third party actually came to power in a province in Saskatchewan, and they put in place a single-payer system, which worked so well that very soon the rest of the country, working people in the rest of the country were clamoring for it. And the demand was so high, I mean, the popularity of that system in Saskatchewan was so high that it put a real fear in the minds of the ruling class parties that if they didn't do it after the next election, that they were going to be in serious trouble, because this third party, which was at that time known as a CCF, would actually be a serious contender for power at the federal level. So I think the point that Jimmy made is really important, that if we, those who have been part of the single-payer effort in California, and those of us who are in this People's Convergence Conference, those of us who are watching, the nurses' unions, other labor unions, other activists, it is extremely important for us to concretize these questions by running a serious candidate against Rendon and other powerful Democrats in California state and pose a serious challenge to them that, we're going to take you down because of what you did, and our campaign is actually going to have an impact. And the way you do it is how every other grassroots campaigns, including ours, has done it, which is have a clear political program and do it what's considered the old-fashioned way, which is take leaflets and a clipboard, go door knocking. I guarantee you, if you're fighting for single-payer healthcare, tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of activists will join you and go door knocking and go to all the people. And as far as Leslie, thank you for sharing your story. It is just completely moving, and the generosity in your heart about talking about people who are worse off than you, that is just really just incredible. It shows the indomitable human spirit. But your question about how do we convince people, I think people are convinced that Democrats are not on their side, but it's not an easy question for people to understand that, well, can we actually do this? Because the question of a third party is not a trivial one. It is a daunting question. So it is understandable if people are wondering whether this can happen. Doesn't it make sense to just join the Democratic Party? But at this moment, it is very different. The Democratic Party is in crisis because the support that they have is very tenuous. It's on the basis of a real anger against corporations, against corporate Democrats, against the Pelosi's and the Schumers and so on. But still the searching of what to do is still going on. So let's make it an individual question. Can we run candidates in California against the corporate Democrats, but serious campaigns with door knocking and leafletting and a real with a real fighting edge to it, and actually winning victories so that we can actually win single-payer healthcare in one state, and that will be a real example for having single-payer healthcare federally. And I just wanted to connect all of this to the question of Kamala Harris, because throughout this weekend, I've heard a lot of people talk about what does it really mean. All these Democrats have become co-sponsors of this new bill that Sanders is bringing about. Does it mean that they are now on our side? Does it mean we can trust Kamala Harris? I mean, these are honest questions. We should, I really urge that we should not scoff at people who are wondering that, because it's a serious question they have. So I think we have to be honest, but be respectful and say that no, Kamala Harris is not on our side. And this is an age-old strategy by the Democratic establishment by using the Republican boogeyman, and it is a boogeyman, let's face it, the Republicans as a the fear-mongering, if you don't support us, they will be there. But corporate Democrats like Kamala Harris are supporting this because they know it doesn't really pose a serious question of healthcare. I'm pretty sure that many of the Democratic entities, corporate entities, are assuring their corporate donors in the back rooms that don't worry, this is not going to go anywhere. But in reality, Kamala Harris represents the more skillful wing of the corporate Democrats, where she is not blatant like Hillary Clinton. It's more of an Obama angle where you pose a little bit as a sort of a friend of working people. But we have to be clear that the corporate wing of the Democratic Party will never be on our side. So we have to fight back in a very clear manner. But doing it actually by posing electoral challenges that are connected to social movements around single-payer healthcare is going to be a necessary starting point.
Okay. So do you have a question? Would you like to? Oh, sure. Go right ahead.
There is an excellent interview with Jimmy Dore and Nick Brana on YouTube that people who are skeptical or afraid of the third party, where you really do a great job of explaining it and making it possible. And I encourage everybody to watch that. You do a great job.
Okay. I can certainly use the views. All right, let's go right here in front. What's your name?
My name is Pedro Hernandez. I'm actually from California. So, and I'm from San Francisco.
Pedro.
Sure. Thanks so much. It's been an enlightening conversation. So in California, we have top two, right? So it's an election system that advances a plurality, two plurality people in a primary election that both advance. And so far, it's only been two Democrats, and that's how you've seen a lot of mod Dems actually get elected. For third parties and third parties that were wanting to have electoral success, how much are the rules of the game factored into your campaign strategy? In Seattle, they have from district election system, right?
Not the
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's changed, but anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the election system rules themselves.
Yeah, you know what? Okay, I'll do real quickly. I'll just say that I don't like that system, and you know, now Republicans just run as Democrats, and so then everybody's a Democrat, and it doesn't mean anything, and so we're stuck with the pharmaceutical lobbyists as the head of our party, and
Let's take a couple questions at the same time, or a few questions.
Okay, let's take a few questions. Sir, right there, go ahead.
Point me.
Right there.
Who are they pointing?
Right there, the gentleman in the gray shirt. Go ahead.
I think you forgot about NOTA, who won the election in November. You're forgetting about none of the above. More of those people voting age did not vote than Trump won, than Hillary won. You have to forget her. We don't need Democrats. You're going to come to us because of the NOTA that you're going to enroll, and we're going to enroll in voting for the first time.
All right, that's a great point. Right, let's do this gentleman in the red shirt, and then we'll go one in the back.
Thank you. The event page for this this event states, and it was also paraphrased by Nick on the stage, that we have, this is Sanders' quote, "We have already won the battle of ideas." And then it also follows by noting that, you know, Republicans are in office in the White House, they're in office in Congress. What kind of a victory is that, and it has been won, if that is the result? You know, regarding, I mean, and why is this the result of the so-called battle of ideas? I mean, I think that the question of what Sanders did during the election, he purposefully stated on stage with you, Mr. West, that he was running to encourage support for the Democratic Party. That was the purpose of his campaign. And then when he wrapped up his campaign in the primary, however undemocratically it all resulted in, he supported Clinton. And then he led people to Trump. And the role of Socialist Alternative, the role of the Green Party in doing that has also been to encourage illusions during Sanders' run in the primaries. Now we have a situation where Trump is in office. There are illusions in the Democratic Party, and we're saying you're making excuses about it and saying that they won't self-examine. Well, I think that the individuals here who have made, and the organizations are here that have made excuses to promote illusions in Sanders and now are trying to draft him for a new party. What are they trying to do? Have it happen again? Do you want this corporate flack to come and lead another movement? A movement of the working class? It's not possible. And we are saying that the working class needs to break from the Democratic Party, support the Socialist Equality Party, read the World Socialist website. We will expose every last one of you who have promoted illusions in this corporate warmonger, in this corporate party.
Okay. All right, thanks. All right, in the back. You know what? Can you go in the back row? There's a question in the back row. There's a question in the back row.
Not to divert away from that last inflammatory comment. Okay, raise your hand if you know of the revolutionary reform that passed in Maine last November. Revolutionary in terms of empowering new parties, which is the topic of what we're talking about. Okay, ranked choice voting and was enacted statewide in the state of Maine for federal and state offices. And I'd love to hear some more discussion about that concrete, constructive reform that would pave the way for voters to not feel afraid to vote for new parties because they always have backup votes on their ballot. They have first, second, third choices on their ballot. So it's revolutionary. It seems like an excellent solution to what we're talking about. We're doing the same campaign in Massachusetts to go big and bold and go statewide with it. I'd love to have your insights and support on that campaign.
Yeah, that's a great. I'm all for it. Dr. Jill Stein's all for it. I think that's a great way. Of course, the Democrats are against it because that takes away their leverage to wag their finger and scare you. You know, Malcolm X said a long time ago, the way to get people to vote for Johnson was you show them a wolf and then they run towards the fox. And they did it again. The Pied Piper, they're doing it. They've never stopped doing it. So they're doing it again. And I just think that's ranked choice voting is a great thing. That's what I'll have to say. But anybody else have anything to say? No? Okay. Let's take another question. Right there, young lady. Okay.
I can't sit still because, and I really want Nick to address that. I'm from Maine. Ranked choice voting is great, all that stuff, but I can't let that go. I'm sorry. I really want Nick to address that whole thing because he can.
I think you're right that we should be critical of Bernie, just like we are critical of everyone else. We should hold Bernie. We should hold Bernie to a high standard. That's part of what we're here doing. It was in Dr. West's opening remarks. And in fact, we should always be re-examining whether Bernie is really standing up for what we need him to. For example, Bernie Sanders, recently, there's a lot of information coming out that Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill is not necessarily Medicare for all. That in reality, it's more of a multi-payer system. That it maintains copays. That it actually that it allows wealthy people to opt out. That's not the kind of thing that decades of single-payer activists have fought for. And so we need to keep in our minds then exactly what it is that we're doing in terms of supporting Bernie. Our support in Bernie has to be contingent upon him doing what it is that is in the benefit of working people and then in the benefit of the movement. And we need to hold him to account, just like PNHP and other organizations are now, in telling Bernie that no, Bernie Sanders, the way to get really Medicare for all, the way to achieve progressive policies is not to come to the table having compromised away so much of what you believe in. It's to stand clearly and boldly for what you believe in, just like you did during your campaign.
Can I just add something, though? There's one point that the brother from Socialist Equality Party did make that I disagree with, and that is that there was that element, that strong element of reform in the Democratic Party that Bernie talked about from the very beginning, and you're right about that. But if you listen to his speeches, brother, the major theme of every speech was a critique of Wall Street. The major theme of every speech was a critique of corporate power. That's precisely why many who followed Bernie did not follow him into the Democratic Party. That was that theme. Now, we can fight over there, but are you wrong about that, I think? Because I think I was there many speeches more than you were.
Okay, good. Kshama?
I think, I am a socialist. I never hide that. In fact, when we, just a funny anecdote, when we were running our first campaign for city council in 2013, many Democratic Party operatives who, wanted to be supportive, but were so stuck in the old ways, and now still currently the ways of the Democratic Party, which is, doing it through your typical, political consultant, taking corporate money, doing it the usual way, saying that you support working people, but at the end of the day, selling them out. Often they would say, do you have to call yourself socialist when you start a speech everywhere you go? It's not going to be good for you. And in fact, what we proved, when we ran the campaign for the first time, we had no conception that we were going to win. But that's not the only reason you should run left campaigns. You should run left campaigns because it is an organizing tool. And in fact, elections and electoral campaigns are not the most, at least in the beginning, the most favorable terrain for working class movements. But you also should not set up a false dichotomy between social movements and electoral campaigns. You have to run electoral campaigns because our movements need to capture political power. But the way we do it is on a principled basis. And so what we found out is what we've seen, as I said, on a national scale by Bernie Sanders, which is that there is no barrier to the S word. The S word is no longer the dirty word for our generations, which didn't grow up in the Cold War era. The C word, capitalism, is the dirty word because people are seeing that this system has completely failed them and they're not going to get their promised little piece of the American dream. Most millennials are going to be saddled with student debt and low-wage jobs. So absolutely, this is no question in my mind and in the minds of socialist alternative members that we want to ever fudge the question of socialism. But if you are genuinely, as a socialist, trying to organize the mass of working class people, young people, women, black and brown people, into an active social struggle, then we can't we can't set up barriers where we say that if you don't agree with my exact definition of socialism, then we're not going to be working together. And for socialist alternative, what's important about the Bernie Sanders phenomenon in 2016 is not that we think he's right on everything. And, already panelists have been, we've talked about a critique of Bernie Sanders. Socialist alternative had a very important, unique position on the Marxist left where neither did we uncritically cheerlead Bernie's campaign. We were from the very outset, even before Bernie declared officially his candidacy, I personally, publicly, when I was speaking alongside Chris Hedges and Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben and Bernie Sanders the night before the People's Climate March in in New York City in 2014, I urged him publicly to run as an independent because we had predicted that if you're calling for a political revolution against the billionaire class, that's not going to happen from inside a party that actually stands with Wall Street, with the billionaire class. But at the same time, the question, sisters and brothers, it's not about can we attain in our abstract ideas the ultimate moral purity. It's a question of how do we actually organize the millions of Americans who are seething with anger against inequality and corporate domination. And for socialist alternative, it is not about Bernie Sanders, but it is about the millions of people who were electrified by his call for a political revolution against the billionaire class. And we did it. And we did it, and I believe this is the approach we should use in our broader struggle, in our mass struggles. We did it in a very honest way, where neither did we accept any isolation, except isolating ourselves from the millions who were radicalizing around Bernie's program of ending student debt and single payer and so on. But nor did we agree to just lay aside our differences just because he was running. We were very clear, Democratic Party establishment will not allow him to succeed. And when he was pushed out after the DNC, we said he should run as an independent all the way. But at the same time, it would be a fatal mistake for various sections on the left to isolate ourselves from the millions of genuine people who are now radicalizing and politicizing around concrete questions of how to make their lives better, how to fight against police brutality for a truly just society, against climate change. And the differences that we have aren't going to be ironed out in one day and in a classroom or in a conference. These differences have to be engaged in a real way, in a social struggle where you're out there on the streets together, talking, debating real tactics and strategies where something is on the line. When you're fighting for $15 an hour is on the line. You either win it or you don't. It's very real. And so it is a question of not of who said what, but can this tactic work or will this other tactic work? So Socialist Alternative, for example, used an approach where when we won the election campaign, we didn't say the movement that wants to win 15 should follow Socialist Alternative. Neither were we shy about our politics. What we did instead was launch a 15 Now grassroots campaign where we said that no corporate influence would be allowed. We would engage democratically, and we had 2 democratic conferences where we actually had a debate on tactics, which had a real role, decisive role for the movement to play. Should we place an initiative on the ballot or not was a concrete question that we debated. And the movement of 15 Now, actually, literally, we held a vote. Who's for, who's against, who's abstaining. And that was a very important concrete tactic because after we won 15, you got it straight from the horse's mouth. The Chamber of Commerce and the mayor, who's a corporate Democrat, they both publicly admitted that had it not been for the real credible threat of a ballot initiative looming on the horizon, they were not going to relent on $15 an hour. So these are real questions where there will be tactical differences. We have to discuss them, but in a way that is not castigating or talking from on high, but actually debating in a real way where you're honest about your differences, but you're respectful, and you're recognizing that if millions of people are engaging in a social struggle, that is the struggle to be in if you're a socialist.
Yay. All right. You have a question? Want to stand up?
We're going to take one more question, and then we'll go around and answer.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, cool. All right, cool. I'm just going to ask my question. So my question is, well, I'm kind of young. I'm not going to call you guys old or anything. But I'm originally from New York, and I'm 21. And for the few years that I've been doing stuff, I mean, I got my start with Rikers Island, and I think Rikers Island is the biggest like statue to white supremacy in the North. And I feel like New York is one of the most, in the North, is one of the most hypocritical places in America, in which they use the boogeyman of Republican and Southern racism to not address like the new Jim Crow that we're perpetually living in up in the North. So I like to say this, in my community, the only people that I've ever fought against in my young life have been Democrats. You know, I've never fought against a Republican in my entire life. And so there's a lot of different reasons why that might be. You know, the idea of like American exceptionalism, the idea that, you know, we're now colorblind. But then also, I think there's also this idea that black people also aren't necessarily within the working class. Like, those are two different distinctions that we kind of make on the left. You know, totally disrespect to people like A. Philip Randolph and a lot of the black communist struggles, the black socialist struggles. And so my question would be, with like the new consciousness waking up in like my generation, because I think there's a different split, like how do you, with a third party, like what is the role of like young black people within that struggle?
Yeah, just very quickly. Salute the question and your eloquence too, though, brother, and your subtle analysis too, very much so. I know it's running late, but I mean, I think the fundamental reality is that the black freedom struggle has been the leaven in the struggle for democracy as a loaf. There'll be no third party if they don't come to terms with the legacy of white supremacy. There'll be no third party if you don't hit the relation of class and empire and gender and homophobia with white supremacy. And so it's not just a matter of bodies, it's a matter of those who are willing to raise the issue and to sacrifice for it. So it's not just a matter of diversity in the bourgeois sense of how many black people you got, how many brown people you got, because you can have black people who still adjust themselves to white supremacy. Just like you can have women who adjust themselves to male supremacy. How many are going to be serious with integrity and a sense of service of hitting the issue head on? And thank God your voice is a very important voice here tonight, though, brother, that keeps us alive in that regard.
You want to say something? Please.
I think Brother Cornel is right. Thank you for your eloquence, and also for the important way in which you pose the question. And what is the role? I mean, in some ways, there's two things you pose. What is the role of young people and youth in the new struggles, and what is the role of black and brown people, and especially black and brown young people? I think there's no doubt, first of all, if you look at throughout the history of the human race, every time there has been period of political and social struggle, and we are indeed in such a period. And it does not come every time, but we are lucky that at this moment, even though of course, the vast majority of the human race lives in misery because of the conditions under capitalism, at the same time, we're in a historic period where people are radicalizing. And throughout history, you can see that in any period of social struggle, no matter what it is, it's the role of young people in general and the role of the most oppressed young people cannot be underestimated. As a matter of fact, young people play a very important catalytic role in igniting social struggle. If you look at the Egyptian revolution that ended up inspiring the Wisconsin public sector uprising and the Occupy movement later that year in 2011, That the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, and also the struggles that were less publicized in Yemen and so on, were actually ignited by young people chafing under the yoke of a military dictatorship, the lack of basic democracy, and they were the ones who first gave expression to the massive discontent and anger that was there in every layer of society. But it was they, young people, who went, because there's a certain unique role that young people and youth can play in every period for a simple reason that they have much less invested in the current system than older people do. And so they are much more willing to step outside their norms and challenge the status quo. So absolutely, I could not, it could not be overemphasized what Brother Cornel said, that your role, the role of young people is going to be absolutely critical. I think it goes much more than that. In fact, especially if we are talking about the question of race and racism, and you talked about Rikers Island, the mass incarceration, police brutality, we cannot, as was already stated, we cannot dissociate the question of racism and indeed any oppression like sexism, like sexual violence, domestic violence, the oppression against LGBTQ community. We cannot dissociate these questions from the deeper questions about the system itself, from the system of capitalism, and then it poses it in a class manner. So it is absolutely not the correct approach to minimize class in order to artificially talk about racism in isolation of the social and political context and the economic context. And at the same time, we can't do the opposite. We cannot fight against economic inequality, for higher wages, for unionizing, unless our struggles, labor struggles, take head-on the question of racism and sexism and so on. In fact, the history of the labor movement itself shows that as men and women and everybody together, workers in the workplace, were fighting for economic justice and the right to unionize, at the same time, within the movements, we have had to fight against, women have had to fight against sexism, black people have had to fight against racism, white people who stood with black people had to fight against the ideas of racism. We had to fight for the rights of LGBTQ people from within the movement. So it's really important to remember Malcolm X's words. You can't have capitalism without racism, meaning that at the end of the day, we should not believe, and I don't know if there will be agreement on this, but I strongly do not believe that there is anything inherent about human beings or the human race that it's something in our DNA that we tend towards racism or any kind of oppression. If you look at young children who haven't been socialized in any way, they do not have any value judgments. They may look at a black person and white person and say, you're black and you're white, but that is merely an observation of external characteristics. That is not racism. Racism is a value judgment that goes along with the way you look, your identity, your sexual orientation, and following from that, what kind of position, social and economic position, you're offered by that system. So at the end of the day, if we are serious about fighting racism, young people, old people, all of us, we have to recognize that the only real way of fighting against oppressions like racism, like untouchability and against lower caste people in India and so on, we're going to have to connect it to the question of class and the question of capitalism itself. Because as long as you have a system that relies on oppressions to divide the mass that is not benefiting from that system, as long as you have that system intact, it will be impossible to remove these vile evils from our society. And at the same time, we're not going to be able to fight against capitalism unless we also are honest in taking on the question of racism in its entirety and not minimizing it by saying, don't worry, fight for socialism, and then we'll take care of racism automatically. No, that is not how you do it. You fight. If you have a BLM struggle in Ferguson, you will see socialists out there. We had socialist alternative members right there. Yesterday, the guy who spoke, Algier Hawkins, one of our members, he was there on the streets of Ferguson with the Black Lives Matter movement out there. And he was talking about the need to connect race and class in a very serious manner, not in a superficial manner.
All right.
Thank you, Kshama. And I want to say that I am also inspired by this generation, very much so. There's perhaps the most amazing figure for me from last year's election was a poll that was taken of people under 29 and where they asked how many people under 29 would like to see an major independent challenge to the two parties. And 91% of young people said they wanted a challenge. They wanted an independent candidate. They were not satisfied, the Democrats or the Republicans. That's amazing. That's the future right there. So on that note, on the note of bringing the future and realizing it and getting together to really have this discussion about a new party, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Dr. Cornel West. I want to thank Kshama Sawant. I want to thank Jimmy for moderating. And I want to thank all of you for coming here. Thanks so much for being a part of this discussion.
Dr. West. How you doing, brother? Good to see you. Good to see you.
We good? 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 5 4 5 4 1 2 1 2. Hey, it's Jordan with TYT Politics. Revolution is in the air. The draft Bernie panel just ended. You see it's clearing out now, so hopefully we'll get a few people. It was kind of a hour and a half, 2 hour round robin of everything progressive, everything that the progressive movement would need to do to mount a serious third party. There was actually talk about labor unions and how important that is, which I like to hear. There was discussion on ending the war machine, which I think is very important. There was also, a little drama in the crowd, which is kind of nice at a town hall. CNN and these places, they have very organized and very scripted stuff, but there was some real organic outcry in the crowd over some things, which was nice. Obviously, you had Jimmy Dore, Cornel West, Kshama Sawant from Seattle, and Nick Brana. I also thought a really important moment was when they said, we'll criticize Bernie if we have to. Bernie, this is not, this draft Bernie movement is not to bow down to Bernie Sanders. They are going to hold him accountable as well. Now, they dropped off 50,000 signatures yesterday to Bernie Sanders' office. Bernie was not there, but apparently the signatures were received and all that. At this moment, there's no actionable or real science to knowing whether Bernie Sanders would actually listen to these folks and run as a third-party candidate. But the momentum for that is building. I was in panels all day today. There were other panels about reforming the Democratic Party. Should they do that? Should they not? I think you got the idea. They don't want to reform the Democratic Party. There was panels on ending the war machine. There was panels on fighting the corporate media. There was panels on single payer. How do we get that? A lot of progressive talk, and it was very, very enlightening. I'm going to talk to some people who are here, see what they thought. Right here. Right here? Hey. This young man, I've seen him at Black Lives Matter protests in New York City, and you were talking and asking a question. First off, what do you think of the panel, the conference? What do you expect, and what you hear tonight?
Well, I think, one, the panel's great. I mean, if you have Cornel West up there, comes from Sawant up there, it's always going to be good. I think now we're kind of all getting used to each other, and so we're kind of having these discussions. But really, why I came here was to explore the third party option. I'm from New York, where you have the political machine, and so when you talk to the average person, not even just the average black person, if you're going to talk to them about policies, progressive policies, or socialist policies, the first thing they're going to ask you is, are you a Democrat? Mm-hmm. So I think it's time for us to break out of that abusive relationship that we have with Democrats, in which they always smack us around, tell us to either fall in line or get out. and like we keep running back to each other. So I came out here personally. You know, some of my people from my organization also want to come out here as well and explore the idea of like, okay, what are some different pathways we can go? I'm kind of sold on the fact that we kind of need a new party, a new way of thinking, an alternative outside of the two-party system.
And we heard a lot about kind of all the things that encompass kind of how the corporations took over, organizing and re-strengthening labor unions they talked about. They were talking about the need to end the war machine, which is taking up 53 cents of every dollar.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of what stood out to you, because it's obviously it was a lot of focus on the Democratic Party, but to me, listening to it, it was less about the Democrats aren't for us and more about we have to fight the corporate oligarchy.
Right. And I think in that, like, that's why I wanted to ask my question is, like, we don't connect those along, like because of identity politics, like, people don't connect that. Those are, like, black struggles as well. Like, when you talk about 53 cents on the dollar going to the corporate war machine, well, black people don't really have a lot of, like, spending power or buying power to begin with. When you talk about, like, imperialism, right, like, you talk about the touchdown of, like, democracies, right? You look at black people in this position that we are in, like, we're, like, the bottom of the democracy institutions here in America. We're at the bottom of, like, economic institutions here in America. And then that also plays a role in how we deal with other institutions outside of American and American imperialism. So it's like also connecting that. Like when you talk about like campaign finance, when you talk about the fact that we don't have an independent media, that also hurts people that look like me. I think it's also time for us in that workshops to like connect that. Okay, we can all come together. Because you talk about like environmental like racism, that's also a big thing. You talk about Hurricane Harvey, you talk about Hurricane Irma, you talk about Flint, Michigan, you talk about DAPL. Those are things that we can also connect to a broader struggle against like the corporates that take advantage of people and perpetuate these cycles as well.
Hold on one second. Occasionally I have to tell my cameraman to quiet down behind the camera because it's going to be picked up in the microphone. Thanks. I do know. Thank you very much. Now, something that I think is kind of this challenge now is there's kind of like an absolutism about like, no, we will not work with Nancy Pelosi, we will not work with Chuck Schumer, we will not do this, we will not do that, which I think occasionally can be dangerous because like, the bottom line is we got to take change how we can get it. What you were hearing from this, did you take it like do not work with them under any circumstances, or if they come over to our side, we'll work with them? I think
we have to play it as a rule. If they come over to our side, we'll work with them. Like, for example, when you talk about white supremacy, black people have always been negotiating with white supremacy since we've been in this country. So it's always, we have to, know our end goal. Like everybody in here, we have a specific end goal in mind, and that's like either smashing capitalism or working within a third-party system. That's why we're all here, to explore those options, right? We work on a mutual shared interest that the current system isn't working for us, right? But Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, they're not working under the shared interest of like the current system, the status quo isn't working for us. They're trying to get back to the way so that they can, make their pockets rich, they can make their donors rich. So all of us really have to combat those people and not bring them over. We're not trying to win them over, but if they want to join with us, they can. But until that, and because that's not happening, we have to fight against them for what's ours. And we're different than Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, right? They're small, we're many, and we have a really broad coalition, comradeship, friendship that's really strong enough to defeat all these corporate powers.
And what do you think in terms of what will be the roadmap? Maybe Bernie Sanders doesn't join this party, maybe he does, but how do you break through to more establishment Democrats who maybe are dismayed with the Democratic Party after seeing who they just lost to? Maybe they would open their minds, some of the older folks in the Democratic Party, to a third party. How do you break through?
I think it's time for us as people on like the left side really is to like not ask anymore, but start demanding it, right? If we truly believe in this stuff, obviously like you have personal accountability, we need to start knocking doors. Like we need to start investing in young people, like I said, because young people on college campuses historically have been the ones that catalyze change. Like we have all the free time to go out and knock doors and do that stuff. So investing in young people, also knocking out doors, but I'm also saying like, certain litmus tests, like obviously, healthcare for all should be a litmus test, right? And
what a terrible phrase, a litmus test.
Exactly.
But the funny thing is, sorry to cut you off, they have a litmus test.
Exactly.
Their litmus test is fall the fucking line. That's their litmus test. So, they have a litmus test too. Go on.
And it's like testing the misleadership class. Like black people, we have a black misleadership class, which will tell us, okay, wait until later for your freedom. And so we don't have much time. Like, you know, the way climate change is set up, the way these hurricanes are set up, we don't have much time to really, you know, ask for concessions anymore. And we need to start demanding it. We need to start saying, well, if you're not going to give us health care for all, if you're not going to give us, you know, free public college, if you're not going to give us certain things that we can get on our way to like actual total liberation, in my opinion, then we're not going to need you. And that's also by presenting an alternative, right? So the reason why the majority of Americans are okay with Democrats is because they don't see an alternative. Bernie presented that alternative. Okay, now I don't have to struggle to pay for college. We can like present an alternative where my kids aren't in debt, right? My kids can go to school, right? I have like now lead water in my pipes, right? We have a way of, you know, achieving this American dream, even though it's like a false sense of American dream. He presented that alternative, and we need to push it even further and say, look, Bernie provided the opportunity, he provided the platform on like a presidential federal level, but here's what we can do locally as well. Like here's what your city council member can do that he hasn't been doing before. And that's really getting out to a lot of people, one, that haven't known this, and a lot of people who don't care enough to vote, and then also like really shoring up our base as well and saying, we're not going to ask for that stuff anymore. We're going to demand it or else.
Spell your name?
Kenneth. Kenneth.
Last name?
Shelton. Shelton.
And you're with Black Lives Matter New York?
Yeah, great in New York. Great.
Thanks, man.
Thank you. It's always great to see y'all, man.
Ty, get his number. Cool. Anybody else here? Come on over. Hey. What's your name?
Elizabeth.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you were at the conference all day?
Yeah, I was at the conference. I was at the walk to Bernie's office.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the room when we gave the ballots to in his office, and then, or not the petitions, sorry. And then I was there last night for Jimmy Dore's show.
Okay.
And I've been here since about noon and going to all the...
So you've had like a socialist overload the last 24 hours.
Yeah.
What did you think of the panel? Oh, yeah, get your hair out of the way. If I tell her, it's, you know, bad news. You know, the thing that stuck out to me wasn't as much about the Democratic Party. I mean, there's a lot about that, but it was more about taking it to the corporations and the corporate oligarchy. What Kshama Sawant said about climate change, we need to demand that these corporates fall into public hands because we don't have any time. What do you think about that message about the Democratic Party, but also that?
I really support what they said. I mean, I really supported what they were talking about the spiritual aspect of it, and I was actually at the panel, you were on it, with Allison from Standing Rock, and I feel like that spiritual renewal is what can fuel this. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to climate change, their whole concept of the mother and that this planet is an organism and that we're part of it and it's feminine and it's basically retaliating. I mean, it's absolutely accurate. It is a living, breathing thing. When you look at the gravitational pulls of the sun and the moon, it literally expands. It contracts and expands. It's living. And so
what you're kind of saying is like, if we need a spiritual renewal, that our politicians have no soul.
Precisely. And everything that we need for that renewal, I mean, I know I went to the alt-right protest in Laguna because I'm from LA, and I went there and I was talking to the organizer of the vigil there, and he was talking about how there was an attack on the nuclear family and on masculinity, and he's absolutely right. And it's the Democratic Party, the DNC, the liberal politics paints it to be that it's it's because they're defying the LGBT, all of that community, and it's like, no, that's not what the attack is. The attack is on the adultery that's going on. The attack is on the spiritual degradation of my culture and my community. And I mean, I'm on my way to England right now to study my Druid Celtic roots to find that spiritual healing in myself so I can come back to my men and talk to them about it, because they're the ones that are in power right now. They're the ones that are propagating all of this and that are following in line with Trump. I mean, I remember talking to them about Trump, and they were laughing along with him, and they didn't see there was a disconnect. And so if we want to, at least for me, from my lane on it is, if we want to start creating a different political path, it starts with our culture, it starts with our perspective, it starts with our consciousness. Or because if we can't imagine where we're going, then we're going to destroy ourselves in arguing.
Hold on. Ty, I can't focus if all I do is hear you. Yeah. I think one of the interesting things is about spirit and things like that. I literally can't hear what she's saying because you're fucking so loud. We like to fight on air. Part of that spirit is fear. I think a lot of people have lived in fear. They were talking the lesser of two evils. We don't want to vote. We have to vote for Hillary because of Trump, and we're afraid of the apocalypse and all that. A lot of people didn't realize the apocalypse was kind of already there. I mean, Standing Rock happened under Obama. Flint happened under Obama. A lot of bad things happened under Democratic presidents. Do you feel like part of that spiritual awakening you're talking about needs to be people finally no, we have to focus on the long term, not the short term.
Saying enough is enough, and I mean, if you listen to what the Lakota people, their mythology about the black serpent, and then you look at the mythology of the evangelical Christians and Cyrus prophecy that Trump is apparently doing. I mean, they're trying to bring about this apocalypse, and it's everything that is a death is just a rebirth of something else. So it's fine, let them destroy themselves. What are we going to do to bring something else up? I mean, Milo Yiannopoulos was talking about how he's I don't want to create a movement. I'm not trying to create a movement, I'm trying to destroy it. It's fine, go ahead, fucking destroy it. Excuse my language, but fine, destroy it. Destroy all you want, but I'm here to pick up the torch when you all are done, so that we can go somewhere else. And by somewhere else, I'm talking mentally, not yeah.
Cool. And lastly, do you feel, I mean, obviously they dropped off the petitions, Bernie wasn't there, it doesn't seem like he has responded. I don't want to say he hasn't not responded, but it's not like there's momentum for it at this moment that he would actually do this. What do you think, whether he does or doesn't, what do you think the Draft Bernie movement, where does it go from there? Maybe it's not Bernie actually running, but where could it go, bigger picture, all these people that have been trying to get petitions and trying to get Bernie to run third party?
Well, I think I always took it as Draft Bernie because it's not about Bernie. It's never been about Bernie. He's not the demigod that Trump is. He's a symbol of something that we've all been seeking for. So it's okay, cool. If you're not here, you're just a dude. Awesome. We're gonna go be what you told us we could be. And what I feel like that is the grassroots movement that we've all been seeking for. I mean, I was in it was the Independent Politics and Third Party, and they were talking about ethics, the ethics of Aristotle and what that meant. And I'm oh, wow, I'm going to go buy that book now. And that to focus on locals. I mean, I don't know my local government. I mean, right now I'm kind of in the middle of a travel period, so I can't, but I'm going to England. I can go, I'm actually planning on going to study the Green Party over there and what are their successes, what are their failings, because then I can come back here and I can have some knowledge of where we can go. I know right now there was the People's Model, which I don't remember his name, but he's in North Carolina. I don't remember his name, but he was amazing, and he had the People's Model, which was basically a 4-step of what you do to basically create a political party. And it was that you hold 4 meetings, and the first one was the introduction, and that one was actually introduce yourself to the people that come in. Stop talking about the politics. Stop talking about hey, and now we're going to tell you about single healthcare. But actually being how are you doing? What's going on? Oh, so his example was somebody hurt themselves on a ski trip. Well, guess what? We have this plan that will help that person that you just told me about. So making it more personal. And then the second one was on causes, and that one's on the issues. So that one is more specific, and that one has debates. And then the third one was on, or I think the third one was on debates actually, and the fourth one was a community event that everybody comes to. And having that practical practical application just given to me right now, I'm like, sweet, I can brainstorm now, I can be creative, I can go to my friends and be like, hey, let's start this up. And it's okay if it's only 4 people right now. We can invite our friends. I mean, I know colleges that can do this immediately. Right. So they brought a lot of really tactical information to us, and I'm really, really excited about.
Cool. Say and spell your name for us.
Elizabeth Higgs, Elizabeth Higgs.
Good luck in England.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Tim Black, come over here.
Brother.
Hey, man.
What's up, man?
How you doing?
I'm good, man.
I keep hearing these renewed rumors that we hate each other.
Yeah.
I don't get it. We hug. I call them every Sunday morning. We talk socialism.
Because they know how you treat black people.
Oh, here we go. No, let me tell you something. Real talk. Literally, I got music blaring in the background. Wait a minute. No. I got music blaring in the background. I got Ty screaming at the top of his lungs. Whatever he's doing, I can't hear this girl's answers. But no, I'm a racist. Get the hell out of here.
Calm down. What I'm trying to do is like show people exactly what's going on. They want to know about the Young Turks. I'm telling them. I'm just kind of giving them a little course run of what we do and how we do it. Yeah. But you know.
No. Stay here for a second.
So Tim, what's happening, player?
What's up, man?
How they treat you out here?
I'm good,
you
man.
You good? How did you?
What city we're in?
You a hater.
It's real too, because that's how I met you. You was like, you were interviewing me, and Ty was like, "Yeah, motherfucker." Right? And I'm like, "What the hell?" Like, but you keep it real than real.
He doesn't understand volume and decibel. Can I speak with this man? So you and I were actually standing next to each other while this panel was going on. What were your initial thoughts of the conversation?
Dude, you said it. It went from fun, light. It went from inspiring to like dirty, like angry, right? You know, and I understand people pissed off. Look, this was my thing. I'm going to see what Bernie's going to do with this. But after this, Jordan, it's over. It's like, that's it. Gloves are totally off. But I wanted to give him this opportunity. Look, we got a lot of time before 2018. A lot of time before 2020. So we could have gave him a couple months to see, is he going to come around or is he going to keep saying, go become a Democrat? So, like, this is it. He wasn't in the office, so we don't know. But in a couple of days, I think we're going to know. And if he just ignores us, that's his answer. Right. And we move the fuck on. Yeah. That's it. And we call him out like we would anybody else. Yeah. That's what I'm going to do. What do you think, man?
Well, I also thought, based on what the conversation was, they were talking a lot about not just the Democratic Party, but really starting to aggressively, not violently, but aggressively taking on the corporate state. So Kshama Sawant was talking about, no, like, we can't wait. With climate change, we need to take public ownership of oil companies, and that's, to most people, very radical, but in the times we're in, if you're looking at the track of Hurricane Irma, it's actually looking like it's going to hit where I went to college really bad, Tampa, Florida. So, yeah, I mean, I think this, to me, I've always been, I don't give a shit what works, as long as it works. Right. I think we need to go the quickest way to get progressive W's on the board, and I think that, to me, what's good about this is whether Bernie does it or doesn't do it, it doesn't seem like these people are, it doesn't seem like they're baking their whole cake on Bernie. It seems like if he doesn't do it, there's now an infrastructure.
Shit, Jordan, people act like they don't even know the name. It was Draft Bernie for a People's Party. It wasn't just Draft Bernie. We shortened it, but it's really about the party. And the party will continue. And we're going to have like liquor and weed and dancing. We're going to have a lot, we're going to have a real party going, guys. So that's what I'm about. That's what, I think this whole gathering is about, like convergence. I don't care if you're Democratic Socialist or Socialist Alternative or Republican Democrat, it doesn't matter. We come together on issues and we just move forward. That's what we need, right? So the issues haven't gone anywhere, so why are people like bailing? I don't get it. Also, I said this yesterday, I'm going to say it again because I think it's a hot line. Bernie Sanders was the Steph Curry of politics. If you can get that guy, you get that guy. Now, people are saying you shouldn't get that guy, they must want to lose. So that if he's available, you try to get him. This is the game of our lives.
I prefer LeBron James, but that's fine.
Bron. Well, Steph Curry's the future. But you get my point. So like, I'm hearing the criticism. We always hear about something.
Well,
at the end of the day, I think we know what to do now.
Listen,
Keep moving.
I've always said this. I think absolutism is a dangerous thing. I think you need to know who your real enemies are. So you might not like everything Bernie does, but to kind of equate, like one gentleman was saying, kind of equating Bernie like with Nancy Pelosi, like,
oh, God.
I'm sorry, but that's just not.
Who has Nancy Pelosi inspired?
Right.
You know
So like, yeah, you know, you're not going to like what every politician does. I don't like everything Bernie does. I don't think his policies, his foreign policy went far enough.
Right.
But I mean, if your standards and your expectations are basically that people agree with every single thing you agree with, as foaming at the mouth as you agree, it's going to be a very lonely locker room, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. What we're going to need is people with charisma, people with ethics to join this movement to get it some legs, to get this new party some legs. So that's what I want to talk to Nick about.
And I also think the one thing you could thank Trump for is there's a lot of awoken people across both party lines. A lot of them voted for a con man, but I think even Republicans are awoken. If you look at polls, even Republicans are now for raising taxes on wealthy people. Republicans, I think it was near 50%, believe in some form of Medicare for all. You have Republicans who disagreed with the bailout, over half the country. You have Republicans who disagree with the endless war. So people are more open to this message. Maybe some of them are going to Tea Party rallies. Maybe some of them are coming here. Some of them are racist and some of them are angry. But the bottom line is, I think the polls show the majority of the country is independent. So whether it's Bernie joining this party or something else, I think there's real momentum to break up I would forget Democrats, Republicans, the neoliberal establishment.
Yeah. Man, that's exactly how I feel. And I think now that we see what's going on with this, we just pivot to building this movement. Build this movement out, bring more attention. And I said this to Kshama Sawant yesterday. Like, yo, I know we don't like Trump and we detest a lot of Trump policies, but we need to also fight the reason why we got Trump. Yeah. So let's do that, because there are new Trumps growing. Yeah. Like, there's new Trumps growing every day. And if we don't watch it, we're going to get more Trumps going forward. So, you know, the boogeyman shit, we need to like bring the knob down on that and bring the volume up on what are we going to do about it.
Well, I also think that one danger is, so if Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, if they're getting in front of the cameras, fighting for the Dreamers and all that, I can't sit here and criticize them for it. Yeah. It's the right thing to do. But they also, in a way, they might be playing identity politics to the nth degree. They're doing the right thing, don't get me wrong. We should fight for the Dreamers, we should fight for that. But that puts cover on what they're doing that same night, which is having fundraisers with the big banks, big oil, big pharma. So I think there's a danger in, credit them when they deserve it, if they deserve it, but don't take your foot off the gas of what they're doing to you economically.
You know what? I know exactly what you're talking about. Betsy DeVos, she said we need to take another look at the my letter to the colleague, which is the modification to
sexual
Title IX, to Title IX, right? So it hurt me because she's got some points. Like, there are people who are being accused and they're suffering a lot behind this Title IX to the modification. So she has a point. Now, I don't like her stance on charter schools. I don't like that she basically bought a job in the White House. I don't like this shit, right? I think she's grossly unqualified for a position. But no one should say that a bill or a law is perfect. Like, we can take a look at this modification and make sure it's working. We got like 4 years of data. Let's look back and see, okay, can we improve it? Now, I'm not saying her improvements are going to be good, but I'm saying to just out of hand dismiss and say she's sexist or she's, all these misogynists or whatever, I think that's a mistake. I think there are some extremes that the schools are taking certain activities I don't think is appropriate. Like, I read one story, no bullshit, Joan, I read one story. There's a couple that was fighting, like horse playing, man and a woman, boyfriend and girlfriend on college campus. Somebody saw them wrestling and went and reported it, said, I saw sexual assault. They called these two couples in. They called the couple in and said, what was going on? And said, oh, we're boyfriend and girlfriend, we're playing around. Do you know they still expelled that guy out of school? So it didn't matter that the people that are involved, the actual victims, said, no, this is my boyfriend. We're just joking around. We had a couple beers. We're running around. We're joking. This is how we joke around. So yeah, there are some extremes. And I hate the fact that Betsy DeVos was the messenger of this, because I don't want to agree with her on anything. But yeah, we need to take a look at that. And that's sort of like what you were saying, that, hey, just because someone else comes up with the idea doesn't mean you trash the idea. You take a look at it.
Listen, if Nancy Pelosi comes out tomorrow and says, I'm done taking Wall Street money, and I'm for single payer, and then she goes on the road with Bernie Sanders and she backs it up, and she stops having these fundraisers, I'll walk around with an I Heart Nancy shirt. To me, it's not, yeah, there's going to be memes now with that. It's not a personal thing. It's that they're doing the wrong thing, and they're not advocating for the right people. So if, Jimmy says it too, I mean, if Nancy Pelosi, if these people come over to our side, it would be very stubborn and short-sighted to say, no, get the hell out of here.
Yeah, I understand. You know why? Because if you're going to punish them when they don't, and you punish them when they do, what the fuck, man? Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, I get you, but it's hard when there's somebody you don't trust them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's the thing. It's like, oh, God, like if Hillary changed her stripes, it'd be like, I can't trust you, though. You might stab me as soon as I turn around.
Well, that's why these, the writers from Politico and all these people. But Jordan, she ran on the most progressive platform ever. I'm like, she was about to wipe her ass with that progressive platform. So, yeah, journalists in D.C. don't seem to have this thing called cynicism. Lastly, whether Bernie does this or not, I think that what's important is the momentum continues. And I also saw here you have Dr. Jill Stein was here. You have the Progressive Independent Party, the Socialist Alternative Party. There was some discussions going on. It seems like parties have their infrastructure that they've developed and they want things their way. But it seems like people are willing to at least talk to each other among the different parties and maybe form some type. I don't know about a coalition, but some type of working relationship.
Working agreement. I already talked to Kshama and say, hey, we need to try to expand this socialist idea, like to express it to people so they understand what it means. Because if all you had to do was rely on Bill O'Reilly to understand what socialism is, you'd hate it too. Like his definition sucks. So yeah, we are working together, talking together, networking, and I think that's good for our country. It's good for all of us. Yeah.
Thanks, brother.
Man, thank you, brother.
Tell people where they can watch you.
Watch me at TimberlakeTV.com. Cool. And thank you, Jordan. I appreciate it. Yeah, my man.
One last guy. Got to get the locals in here. Hold on. Well, let me talk to you first. What's your name?
Aaron Goldberg.
And you're running where?
I am running in the 10th District of Illinois for the U.S. House of Representatives.
What are you running as?
I am running with the Green Party.
So Illinois, probably next to Jersey, maybe Detroit, maybe Michigan, most corrupt city in America, most state in America. What kind of issues are you running on in Illinois? Because Illinois, just like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, it's been decimated in terms of manufacturing, labor unions, like the working class has been decimated.
Well, the biggest things I want to run on are actually water quality. We have the most polluted lakefront in the entire country up in Waukegan and Zion. And also at the same time, we have a whole bunch of nuclear waste that's completely undealt with. By the way, it just happens to be in a predominantly African-American community. And we have no long-term plan for dealing with it. There is no long-term plan for cleaning up the lake. In general, also, Brad Schneider, who's the incumbent Democrat, is basically the biggest cookie-cutter corporate Democrat that there is. And his Republican opponent, Jeremy Wines, go figure, they have both been on the payroll of the American-Israeli Political Action Committee. And just recently, Brad Schneider rescinded his endorsement of Daniel Biss because of Daniel Biss's choice of lieutenant governor. Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who was on the Democratic Platform Committee advocating for Palestinian rights. And because of that, I decided to get more involved in the governor's race. And in general, I want to be a huge advocate and speak out for Palestinian rights because I am actually of Ashkenaz ancestry. Mm-hmm. And I feel that it's my duty as someone of that ancestry to speak out for the Palestinian people.
And who are you running against again?
Brad Schneider as a Democrat incumbent and Jeremy Wines as a Republican.
Okay. And you probably early 20s, mid-20s?
I am 23. I turn 24 next week.
Now, what inspired you? Because I don't know if it was Bernie, he called on people to run. I don't know if it's the Green Party. What kind of made you take the step? to run. Because I think a lot of people, maybe not for 2018, but a lot of people are starting to think like, oh, the Bernie movement is now evolving. It might be Bernie again in 2020. It might not, but like a lot of people are, I've interviewed at this point dozens and dozens of people that have been running.
So I've always been incredibly interested in politics. I think I started watching The Daily Show religiously in the 6th grade. This is something I've always wanted to do. Specifically, my two biggest idols have been Bill Nye, the Science Guy, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. I want to spend my entire life, I care about nothing else. I want to fight to prevent and reverse the effects of climate change. That's the only thing I want to do. And the only way I can possibly do that is through politics.
And where can people find out more about you?
AaronForScience.com, Aaron for Science on Twitter, Aaron for Science on Facebook, Aaron for Science on Snapchat, Aaron for Science on Patreon, and Aaron for Science on Instagram.
And Aaron for Science in your dreams too, apparently. Wait, show them. There you go. That's one way of doing it. Spell your first and last name.
Aaron. That's Aaron Goldberg. Goldberg.
My Jewish brethren. Good to meet you. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, as we close it out, again, it was the People's Convergence Conference mixed with Draft Bernie. Seems to me that a lot of people here, kind of like the People's Summit, other things, were pretty galvanized. At these conferences, sometimes there's some people who might be a little bit more passionate than others, which can kind of create some angry things. But I think that's fun. I'd rather they want me to apologize to you. Audience, if you're trying to do an interview and you got 1970s music blaring on one end, and then you got your camera guy screaming on the other, then you could apologize. I heard it. That's the problem. I can't listen to the person I'm interviewing. Okay, well, I'm not apologizing, so revolt against me if you want. But as I end, we'll put up some of this stuff on the YouTube channel, and we're going to be, I believe, live this week. I'll be in Germany, actually, but Nomi's going to be back here in D.C. On Wednesday as Bernie is pushing forward a Medicare for All bill. So she'll be covering that. We'll talk about the Medicare for All bill, explain what's in it, what's not this week. Thanks for watching. YouTube.com/TYT Politics. Subscribe if you haven't. YouTube.com/TYT Politics. Peace.